delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, panelists, for following me in the proceeding. So I thought that since I'm the first speaker, I would try to give the big picture. My big question is, the European Union's Eurozone crisis, is this a failure of economics or a failure of politics? And think about this. It's really a worrying time for the Eurozone and the EU. It's actually a crisis that never needed to happen, as I'm sure, as I'll talk about in a minute. But the question is, why is this happening? Is it the economics? Is it about economic structures or economic policies? Or is it about politics? What about the institutions? Is it a question of leadership? And where is democracy in all of this? So first we start with the crisis. What crisis, or rather which crisis we have to talk about? Because there are actually three stages in the crisis. 2007, 2008, it was a banking crisis. And to be perfectly honest, the EU got good marks in the banking crisis. At least at the time, fast reactions, or banking bailouts, etc. 2008, 2009, the second crisis was the crisis of the real economy. A bit more mixed in terms of results. You had fast reaction from the UK and France, whereas Germany was slow, reluctant. In the discourse it was, well, the stimulus won't work because Germans save. As it turns out, that Angela Merkel, 2 months later, actually gave a lot of money in the stimulus, and the Germans didn't save. But much more importantly, they put the money in short-term jobs and kept people in work, which was very useful. Okay, but 2007, things really unravel, and that's the sovereign debt crisis, and the the Eurozone has very bad marks. It's slow, there's German reluctance on the Greek bailout, and one thing leads to another, which I'm sure we'll all be talking about more. So, questions about these crises. First, is the problem the banks? Well, yes, but not in the first part of the crisis, not in 2007-8, today. Of course, had something been done more quickly, say, in Spain at the time, but you'll have to tell us about that, perhaps this wouldn't have been his problem. But then, is the problem competitiveness? There's the whole discussion of North versus the South. The North is competitive, the South is not. So, is that the problem? Another question, is it about current account balances? Deficit countries versus surplus countries. The North is surplus, the South is deficit. So if we could just get those Southerners to quit having deficits, everything would be fine? No. Our economists will tell us more about that. Is the problem the structure? Is this an optimal currency union? Every economist has said it's not. So is that the problem? Or is the problem rather the markets, as they are pounding the Southern European countries again in terms of interest rates on bonds, going up, up, up. In Spain, it's back up to, I think, 6 and possibly going up to 7%, whereas Germany is in great shape at, I don't even know what it is now, maybe 1%, but in any case, it was really interesting. There was an article in Bild, which is a very right-wing German rag, and they actually said, you know, actually, Germany has lent 48 billion euros to Greece. It has saved, in terms of, because of the interest rates on its bonds, it has saved 60 billion. So maybe this crisis is actually good for something. It's not. But this is just to ask then, so is this a problem of economics? Clearly structures matter. There are indeed problems of the initial design, the initial EU design. It's not an optimal currency area. It's a monetary union without an economic union, not a fiscal union in any sense, and no political union. So is the answer deeper Eurozone integration? That's the big question. And if it's deeper Eurozone integration economically, does it mean what? Does it mean the European Central Bank acting as lender of last resort? Well, Mario Draghi just did that a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. But is that enough? I think the other panelists will talk about this, but what more can you do? Pooling debt through e-bonds? Germans say, we don't want our debt. Slovakians say, wait, we don't want to pay for Germans, for the Greeks, etc. What about a bigger bailout fund? A European Financial Stability Facility, temporary. Now they're putting together a European Stability Mechanism, but it's not very big. Do you need something bigger? A European Monetary question. Farther, I think it was Wolfgang Schäuble. We talked about a Ministry of Finance. Is that what you need? Okay, so a whole range of questions. But the big question is, as this is taking so long, could you have an accident? Brexit, as the latest term is, a Greek exit by mistake. They're now starting to talk about that. Again, after it looked. Okay, policies also matter. Austerity policies across the board. Any of the neo-Keynesians in the room? You know the answer. Bad. But if there are any neoliberals in the room, no, it's good. Or neoliberals. Germany believe in rules and neoliberal. Austerity across the board. Does this work? Big problems in terms of different varieties of capitalism in these countries, different growth models. So, question about across the board austerity policy as well. It's okay. So that's on the economic side. But is this maybe instead a problem of institutions? Inbuilt obstacles to EU action. There's a no bailout clause in the treaty, in the Lisbon Treaty, and it's been in the treaties before as well, since Moscow. So is it that there are rules that are obstacles to the EU taking action, that it's not really the problem of politics, but a problem of, or it is a problem of institutions? In fact, there's uncharted territory on the rules, not only the no bailout clause, but the ECB isn't supposed to act as a lender of last resort. And some rules are obstacles to action. The unanimity rule, all the member states have to agree. Will the UK ever agree? Anyway, it's not in the Eurozone. How do you deal with the Eurozone making decisions? 17. And you've got 27 member states on any treaty change having to say yes. So that's another kind of problem. Or that's a problem of, all of those are problems of institutions. What about a problem of leadership? There were lots of obstacles to taking EU action, but actually action was taken. But maybe that it's each time too little, too late. Certainly in the 2008 crisis of the Central and Eastern European countries, why didn't someone say at the time, let's set up a European Monetary Fund? Instead, as the Hungarian Prime Minister had this cri de coeur saying, please don't put down an economic iron curtain. Save us. European member states said, sorry, you go to the IMF. And then they said, but don't depeg your currency from the euro. So no possibility of devaluing outside. The Greek crisis, 2010 to 2012. Germany delayed. That was about politics. Merkel was worried about election on May 9th in North Rhine-Westphalia. And so she kept thinking, oh no, it'll go away. We'll just tell the Germans, the Greeks, you solve your own problems. They didn't. She also lost the election. And then there's the Irish crisis, the Portuguese crisis, I won't go into all of that. But you're also seeing problems of politics as a result of not resolving the crisis. The rise in the extremes on the left and the right. They're actually pretty scary. You've got two anti-democratic governments now in Romania and in Hungary. You've had in Greece in the last election, they didn't really win, but there was concern that the neo-Nazis in Greece were going to gain lots of seats. Or on the other side, unreconstructed Marxists. Spain, look at the kinds of what happened yesterday. Greece. So we've got to talk about problems of politics as well. And what about democracy? Where's democracy in all this? It doesn't matter how many times the people protest. This is at the national level. You can talk about it as politics without policy. As EU policies are removed to as policies, national policies, were formally decided at the national level with political debates on the left and right, are now taken up to the EU level, at which point it's policy without politics. It's all about technocratic decision-making or intergovernmental national interest amongst the countries. Where's the politics of the left and right so that you would actually have debates about maybe it shouldn't be neoliberalism, or maybe it should. Whatever the arguments are, at the very least you legitimize the policies by having debates and then elections. But this is not possible in the EU politics, which I call region state. Other people call it other things. I won't go into that. So I guess to conclude, the big question is, how do you address the crisis economically and politically? If this is about trying to make sure that all the economies actually engage in some kind of fiscal discipline so that you can ensure trust amongst the countries, it means probably vetting member state economies as the EU has agreed in terms of the European semester. But how should this work? Should it be what it is now, which is one size fits all? You have to meet these targets, and if you don't, you have to reduce your spending, even if this has a negative impact on growth. And if you don't, you're fine, because it's all about fines and sanctions. Is this the answer? Where is social solidarity in all of this to address the rising inequalities? Can there be any kinds of funding for redistributing social policies? What about unemployment insurance across the EU? But how do you pay for that? Where are the fiscal? Where are the taxes? Do there need to be EU taxes? I like to talk about a European social solidarity tax. We have to make it voluntary for the UK. They're obviously not going to want to pay. But this is pie in the sky. But there are other ways in which you might think of this. Tobin tax, financial transaction tax, cross-border, or cross-border transaction tax in terms of the single market. But whatever happens, it's that these are the things that are not being discussed. It's very early days for that, and in the interim, we have some serious problems. So, what about increasing democratic governance? How do you do that? I have thoughts about that, which you'll have to ask me in the question and answer period. So, thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Jaumendrau. He's a senior research associate and a lecturer at Boston University. He has been a scholar and lecturer at a handful of universities, and today we're very fortunate to have him at Boston University. His primary fields of specialization are industrial organization, applied microeconomics, and microeconometrics, and he has written many publications and articles in these fields, both in English and Spanish. His current interests are in micro-oriented real sector, evolution of productivity for growth, industrial organization, technology, and innovation. And today he will speak about countries that are considered a problem, namely Spain, and competitiveness in the European zone. Also, we found out today that it is Professor Jaumendrau's birthday, so we want to wish him a happy birthday and thank you very much that he's here.
One of the problems of having this CD posted everybody sees. I am tempted to take the date of my birth from the CD, at least from this year or but thank you. Well, I'm sorry, maybe I'm going to disappoint you a little bit because I'm going probably to add more questions, not to answer the questions. Can you help me the slides? Okay. I have put these slides that I have the title of Some Reflections on European Crisis of Microeconomics, because, you know, I am a microeconomist. I think probably the perspective that I am going to give you is quite different from the perspective that will be given by a macroeconomist. I remember the first time that I was here in Boston was 7 years ago. This is some news from The Economist in 2005, 7 years ago. And I was in the third floor of a couple. I was accommodated in the third floor of a house in Cambridge by a very nice couple that had me for less than 1 year. And at some point of time they asked me, well, what we should do with this house, because we have bought this house, but we don't know what is going to happen with the price of the house. And I said, well, I am not a specialist in that, but well, what is in the news is more or less that the price of the housing seems to be overvaluated, and this happens in the United States. This particular news was saying that one of the ratios that gives the idea that there is some overvaluation in the United States was approximately 32%, but and this was something that struck me highly. In the case of Spain, it was near 60%. It was quite obvious at this moment already that it was a bubble going on in the case of Spain in the housing sector. Well, I give this simply as a background. What is the common interpretation of the crisis? This is 2 years ago by an economist that I admire a lot. Some of you are students of mine, and then you know that I usually start my microeconomic course with an article written by Paul. I like many things of Paul, but here I think that he gets the thing completely wrong. I'm sorry. The article says, or starts saying, why Spain is in so much trouble 2 years ago, and in a war, this is the euro, the cause of this trouble. During many years, the years of the boom, of the economic boom, the Spanish government was something as a model. But it seems that problems were developing under the surface. And according to Krugman, but this is a common view in many economists, according to him and these many economists, the problems were that prices and wages rose more rapidly in Spain than in the rest of Europe, on one hand. And on the other hand, that at the end of this process, as you can expect, the Spanish industry was left with costs that made it completely uncompetitive because the wages and prices have rose higher than in other nations. Then the conclusion is, well, if Spain was out of the euro, would have devaluated the currency, and then this would be a solution to this situation. And this is the idea, the main idea of the article. Here comes the title, it's the Spanish prisoner. Then, if you more or less share this type of explanation, this should be a sort of shock for you. I'm sorry that this is Spanish, these are statistics, are European statistics, but I have taken from a bulletin of the Bank of Spain, but I can assure you that official European statistics. You can see that during the 2000, approximately, in approximately during the 2000s, on the one hand, we have on the left the increase of exports, and the two countries that exports have increased in a
faster way are just Germany and Spain. And almost both countries during the 2000s exports doubled. And on the other hand, we have something that is even more interesting, because it's the share of these countries that we have listed at the bottom, the share in the world trade. And you can see that everybody has lost a little share, but the two countries that have kept basically the same share in the world trade from the beginning of the 2000 to the end of this decade are just Germany and Spain. Then economists sometimes we say that competitiveness should be looked at through the data that reveal what is happening. Then this data doesn't seem to say that Spain has lost competitiveness because of very high salaries or very high prices. Because if not, it would be difficult to explain this success in exports. And even recently we can add more data, because this is 11, but recently the exports in Spain are heavy. Well, you should look at the same time at these statistics. This is the list, this is statistics of the World Trade Association that gives you the shares in the world trade of the top exporters. The top exporter is China, share in the world trade of approximately 10%, 10.4%. And after China comes to the United States, but you see that the United States and Germany have more or less the same share in the world trade. What is amazing, because the relative size of the countries obviously favors, or should be favoring the United States. This is telling you that Germany is a quite special country. As it is, for example, Netherlands. It is a very small country with a little bigger than is Catalonia, for example, wants to be a new European state. And you see that has world trade quota is near 4%. Spain is obviously not here, has simply a 1.6. 1.6 is much less than France, is half than France. Obviously the size of Spain is not half France. This means that the relative position of Spain is clearly weak. But then we should talk about that. And this is not a recent phenomenon. It's not a question of the last 10 years. It's something that comes from before. Because Spain has kept just this quota this time. You may say, maybe, but it's a different problem, that during this decade, Spain should have been able to increase this quota, maybe catch up France. Okay? But this is a different thing than saying that has lost competitiveness very recently. It's a different problem. This August I was, they asked me to give a talk in Spain about technology, innovation, and looking at the newspapers, I saw that the European Central Bank had issued a sort of list of policies to be done with respect to the countries that in principle are in trouble, that are Ireland, Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and Portugal. And if you go to the bulletin, you will find this list. I have used more or less the same language. Maybe I have summarized a little bit what they say, but I think it's quite parallel with what they say. If you look at this list, the first impression that you are going to have is that the European Central Bank is proposing everything. Any kind of policy that you can imagine with respect to the countries in trouble is here listed. I have another slide for that. I'm going to go very quickly about them in a moment. Then the impression is that it's not very clear what is the diagnosis of the crisis. In fact, by the relative weight of policies, you can see that they are not so far away from the interpretation of Krugman, for example. Because you can see here the enormous weight that they give. The level of competition is very low. Then we need significant reductions of unit labor cost. They say also profit margins, and they believe in perfect competition. That's interesting because it's not common that central banks recently are so explicit about there are also problems of market power in some markets. But they insist that basically the type of things that they should be down is relaxing protection, employment protection, that is allowing firing the workers more easily, abolishing wage indexation, lowering minimum wages, permitting per level wage bargaining. In fact, in the news in Spain you have many examples of firms in which workers are reaching agreements with the employer of reducing in, say, 25% the wage just to avoid to be fined. Second round of measures. We should have in these countries permanent increases in labor productivity. How? Privatizations. Well, many of these countries have already privatized almost everything, but it's a little difficult. Margin is not very big here. Process and product innovations. Okay, this seems something a little different of the rest of the story. Boosting the skills of workforce. Well, one is suspicious that the skills of the workforce depend a little bit of what you are producing. Maybe if you have process and product innovations, you need more skills from the workers just for getting these innovations in the first place, then being able to sell this to the world. And creating more favorable business environment. This is a very general thing. Policy action on structural reforms, liberalizing of immigration, a very interesting thing. Spending should be reoriented. One of the problems of a so big list is that every one of the governments takes the policy that is interested and forgets about the others. I have never heard this, for example, in the Spanish conservative government. They say we should cut, we should cut, we should cut. Never they have said we should reorient spending towards education and R&D. In this sense, I think it's very positive that the central bank includes that. So it happens automatically goes. Okay. Enhance business friendliness, boldness in the face of privileged groups. Okay. And then finally, a very interesting thing. It seems that the European Bank has in mind that in services there is a big problem of prices. As you know, services are more protected from world trade, and it's very clear to me that in Spain it has been given a long time, and increasing the prices of the services that probably has an effect on competitiveness that explains what the data and scores are not displaying. Okay. Well, I don't want to insist more on that. It's long. Maybe in the discussion we can see the things with a little more detail. What is my interpretation of what is the situation in Spain right now? In Spain, for example, the main economic problem right now is that the private debt, families plus big enterprises, is 207% of the GDP. This is a really crazy situation, and has been aggravated this situation during the decade, and basically has been because the investments have been during all the decade, the main investment and the main business of the banks was the lending for development of this housing sector. And the Spanish banks, especially the banks that now have a lot of difficulties, they weren't taking money just from the German banks. The German banks thought that it was a safe and interesting business. This is what is paralyzing right now the country. It seems something a little more complex than the question of high salaries or a problem of non-exports. If you put side by side this type of investment in the Spanish economy during all this time with the needs of Spain, it's very easy to arrive. I am not going to give you more data, but it's very easy to arrive at the conclusion that in fact what Spain needed during all this time was technological innovation, was technological investment, because the exports of Spain are not the exports of France simply because our level of technological development in Spain is less than the level of France, for not to say the level of technological innovativeness of China. What is the reflections that this brings to my mind with respect to the whole crisis? Well, first I would say European crisis reflects how economic problems today are affecting countries with very different levels of development. I have insisted in the case of Spain because it's surprising, but it's not surprising. Just with Spain is happening what should happen, because it's in an intermediate position with respect to Greece, with respect to Portugal, that are less developed countries, and they have been struggling much more than Spain with a world in which exports, for example, cannot be based now in simply cheap labor, because cheap labor, there are a lot of cheap labor in China, and in addition with technology that is each day better, and it's becoming better and better. And probably in the exports of these countries, this has had an impact much bigger than the impact in the case of Spain. Then there is no simple macro solution valid for everybody. The main question that all this crisis brings to me as economist is, how can be that during a decade the incentives to investment drive the investment in the wrong direction, in the direction of house development? How is possible that all the private investment that today is so heavy in Spain has been for something that at the end had no value, instead of technological investments, instead of trying to push further the sectors that had some possibility in exports? How this can be? And I am a free market person. I think that one of the explanations of that is probably that the market has not worked enough well. For example, if you want data, some data about that, I think that never a bank has been bankrupt in Spain. Then, when people do investments through banks in Spain, among other things, think that are completely safe. And government seems that is willing to try to solve this crisis without any bank paying for the past investments. This is a problem of the incentives that is quite problematic. I would say that Spain basically what needs is technological investment and competition in the economy. And if you think of this crisis from this point of view, maybe the conclusion is that then you need an Europe that is useful to promote coordinated economic growth in very different economic situations. I don't know how this is politically possible. Sorry for that. Thank you. Thank you.
And up next, we have Professor Ban. So you guys know he's only recently joined the BU International Relations Department earlier this year, and he's currently an assistant professor of international relations. Beyond this, however, he's an author with expertise on the economies of Europe and Brazil, as well as the political economies of states in crisis and transition. As this region is definitely a place that's in crisis, we're excited to hear his views on that and how the institutions involved are affected.
I went to grad school and studying economic crisis was the most uncool thing. It was like listening to audio tapes or something in the early 2000s. You know, crises were happening somewhere in the third world, you know, in Latin America. You know, the lazy Latins, you know, they always have crises. Who cares? Unless we don't have money, we have money there, we shouldn't be worried. And then the Asians are corrupt. That's why it happened to them in the late 1990s, right? There's always this like exogenous thing happening in the world periphery, right? And now there's a little bit of soul searching taking place inside my own discipline, and you know, very serious economists are looking into, you know, lessons for the developed world from the third world, right? You know, we came to live that. I lived through one of the most traumatizing economic crises of the past 50 years, which is the post-communist crisis. I'm originally from Romania, when, you know, we lost GDP in 1 year more than the average in World War II. That gives you an indication of how bad that could be. So if Eastern Europe is any guide, you can actually push economies really, really far. You know, you could push economies with going from 0 unemployment into 70 and have no systemic collapse in politics. So in a way, perhaps a lot of East European leaders are giving really interesting advice to their West European peers in terms of the democratic sustainability of this. But what I'd like to say today is, I'm going to keep this really short, is that there's a couple of things that I think the economic crisis brings to the fore. One, and Professor Schmidt has elaborated on this, is the decreasing quality of European democracy, right? Once the beacon of, you know, the main source of, one of the main sources of exports in Europe is democracy, right? This is the European model, the European dream. There was a book in 2005 advocating this as an alternative to the American neoliberal world. That seems to be not particularly compelling in the light of the footage that you see in Spain yesterday, what has happened in Greece, in Eastern Europe. In a way, even if you're a conservative voter in Europe today, and you have a very strong preference against tax increases, there is no way that you could know that that could actually pass through. As we know in the case of Spain, the centerpiece of the promise of the Conservative Party there was no increase in the VAT, and that's precisely what they had to do about 5 months ago. So there's a very interesting and risky process of evacuating citizens' vote from economic policy, and that's one of the things that I think European political elites have to come to terms with. The second is that not only is this extremely risky for the political society, but it has extremely dramatic consequences on some of the issues that Professor Jaumendrau addressed, which is the Europe's competitiveness, right? Okay, fine, we know that the Nordics and the Germans are doing great, they sell a lot of stuff to China and Brazil and other emerging markets. They already have the competitive advantage. Problem, you have another half of Europe that doesn't have that capacity already, engineering and research and development. What are you going to do with that? So the answer to this question has been provided in the content of the austerity packages produced in, you know, from Ireland to Greece. And some of the biggest cuts have taken place in research, development, and education. Now, if anyone can explain to me how on earth we are going to move from medium skill and medium technology production to high technology production, compete with the South Koreans, while we're cutting state investment in these three absolutely crucial realms of competitiveness, you know, I'm willing to move to an island and be dressed in, you know, something very coarse and itchy on my skin. Right? The third thing is that, you know, the rise of extremes, and here, you know, a lot of people have said, I remember the discussions about 4 years ago, political scientists have paid attention to ideological debates, right? There was this is going to be the big moment of the left. You know, you will see, you know, the old left, the hard left will see a pushback, and the social democrats will move to the left, and they will pull the right to the left as well. That hasn't really happened. However, what we've seen is that the two countries, Denmark and Greece, what we would call the hard left, although I don't really like that term, because there's this hard versus soft, which I don't think applies very well in the distinction between the two. But they're pretty strong, let's call them, I mean, if you actually like analyze their economic agenda, it looks like, you know, a Nordic social democratic party in the 1960s. I mean, it's not really a Euro-communist or anything who put the money, but it is extreme by today's standards. In Denmark, they almost won. In Greece, they came pretty close to forming a coalition. Okay? On the right, basically Hungary is being ruled by a far-right coalition. And there are several other, you know, the right-wing parties in a lot of European countries, except Netherlands, surprisingly, have lost. Precisely, you know, once the far right is in power and they actually run things, they're pretty bad at it. And, you know, unlike in the 20s when they were, you know, the fascist system could actually run the trains on time, as they said in Italy, so they could like showcase their managerial skills. This generation seems to be pretty bad at it, fortunately. All right, now the fourth thing that I'd like to say is that there is this really frustrating paradox at the very heart of the European integration process, which is, you know, about almost 60 years long. Extremely successful, prevented wars in Europe, turned poor countries into wealthy countries. So overall, you know, the European integration has been spectacularly successful, right? Bringing, you know, Eastern European and so on. However, it's amazing that the project was designed so tragically flawed about 10 years ago with the introduction of the euro, that European integration becomes a source of European disintegration. And we do see this at several levels. We do see it at the level of the European banking. Basically, banks have gone home. They buy sovereign debt from their own sovereigns. They're no longer these transnational European banks unless they really have to. And with the exception of some of the banks that are really internationalized, like, you know, Santander and the Spanish banks have investments in Latin America, so they can really help them at home. Other than that, basically there's a withdrawal into the national markets and regulatory environments. There is a push for more economic nationalism within this country, so the usual causes of economic liberalism have had a lot to suffer, despite the fact that the European integration process had been designed to be an economically liberal project. And finally, and even worse, I mean, we see this at the level of European societies. And I'm not just talking here about the obviously negative consequences of the collapse of, you know, the European employment machine. If you read the Lancet and studies of psychological studies of unemployment, you know that somebody who's been unemployed for 3 years is lost for the labor force for a very long time. Not to mention productivity to mention. I mean, that's a very dramatic aspect. So even if you look from the perspective of employers, keeping people into unemployment for such a long time and at very high rates of unemployment is actually very bad for business, not to mention that it's really tragic for the people who are actually stuck in it. And finally, another aspect of this integration that, for the life of me, I would have never imagined, even 2 years ago, was that in countries like Spain or Belgium, there are discussions about, not just about autonomy, but about separatism, to an extent that, you know, this was stuff that was happening in the Balkans, right? Remember the backward people in Southeastern Europe? Okay, they do stuff like that, you know, not, you know, people with long experience of democracy in Western Europe. It only takes a very dramatic crisis with sudden and hopeless increases in unemployment levels, with a gutting of redistribution institutions, for those things to happen in very nice, you know, posh kind of places. All right, so what is to be done? I don't know what is to be done. I wouldn't be here if I knew what is to be done. I would be in a much more comfortable place, perhaps. But actually, you know, I have a preference. You know, I have to reveal. I have a preference for a growth agenda, but growth with employment, because I think employment is not just about dignity, but it's also about the most important stabilizer in any political economy. So. How that is to be done? I think there's a very broad ideological debate, because, you know, I don't believe in at least in macroeconomics as a science, I believe in political positions that we take in macroeconomics, vis-a-vis the role of the state regarding markets. Whether we come at this from a Keynesian standpoint or from a neoclassical one, I don't really care, but something has to be done about the growth agenda with employment. And because without that, we're in very serious trouble. Historically, Europe has had as much vocation for producing benevolent and terrible things, right? So we may not want to poke the other side of the beast, okay? Now, the third aspect I would like to touch on, EU institutions, right? I have to disclose this, I love European federalism, I would like a super state, all the tough stuff that a lot of people don't like. However, we really have to think critically about the responsibility of EU institutions in the first place. So there are two levels, pre-crisis and post-crisis responsibilities. Pre-crisis responsibilities include a hubris on the part of the European Central Bank and the European Commission in arguing that European integration arguments shall be translated into arguments about integrating European financial markets. Now, that sounds great in theory, right? I mean, what's wrong with making, Spanish banks and German banks and Swedish banks hang out together? Right, sounds great, but here's the problem. They've taken this so far in the 2000s by saying that an Irish bond and a Greek bond and a Spanish bond that is used as a collateral, right? When banks borrow from each other, they have collateral. Now, most of that collateral on the European market, unlike on the US market, was in the form of sovereign bonds, okay? Now, the assumption beyond all of that is that these bonds would have the same value in your collateral portfolio, right? So if you're a collateral manager in a bank, you basically, if your Greek bonds that you keep as collateral when you borrow on the interbank market, all of a sudden get a haircut, okay? Once they lose value, right? And that comes from, we know the story, right? Most of the processes are beyond the rationality of markets. We know that there is a lot of underpricing of these bonds. At that point, you have to stop buying Greek bonds, even if you're a Greek bank, right? Unless the ECB gives you money to do it, which is what the ECB did in 2009, okay? You can no longer do that. So what became an engine of integration became an Armageddon machine when it came to the European sovereign bond markets themselves. So how do you stabilize this, right? In a normal banking system, right? Traditional, national, let's say the US banking sector, right? The Fed acts as a lender of last resort and provides the liquidity, right? This is what the ECB kind of did in 2009, right? So they saw that, the Greek banks needed collateral, right? So basically the ECB accepted these Greek bonds as a form of collateral, right? So the Greek banks could leave off the difference. It was a form of arbitrage. But once the Greek scandal erupted in 2010, they pulled up. Moreover, and this is what really was very dramatic for Spain and Portugal and Ireland, is that when instead of acting as a counter-cyclical mechanism against sovereign bond rating agencies that are private institutions, who started to downgrade Spain for reasons that were not particularly clear in early 2010, instead of acting against that, the European Central Bank started to look at Spanish bonds and Irish bonds as if they were no longer worth the same as, say, Italian bonds. So in a way, the ECB kind of boosted the downgrading bias of the credit rating agencies, thus contributing to the disintegration that now is trying to fix. Okay? Now, there's a lot of soul searching going inside the ECB about this, and for a good cause. The European Commission, all right? Now, the European Commission has been particularly good at framing, there's a very good book by a French scholar on this, at framing the importance of European financial integration with the story with the sovereign bonds as a form of, you're not a really good European if you don't support that, right? That was the idea. The 1999 so-called Giovannini report. Now, one would expect that the report that led to this kind of convergence of European bonds, right, as a form of collateral in Europe, one of the most important engines of the sovereign debt crisis, would be influenced by European bureaucrats. If you look at the structure of the Commission that supported this regulation, it was 90% private sector, clearing houses, banks, hedge funds, and lawyers. There were 4 representatives from the Commission, and I believe 4 from the ECB. The other 90 people were and that came to be part of the European Commission's public policy. There was not even consultation with the nation states. Okay, so these are the things, the power of expertise that came from the private sector, not from universities, not from the economic profession, which is the usual suspect in this, and not from inside the bureaucracy. It came from the private sector that then had to be bailed out. How much time do I have? Do I have like a few more minutes? Okay, cool. So, and the third, I think the third entity that has to go do some soul searching on this is Germany. And you know, the Germans are right about many things on this, right? I think it's preposterous that the Greek tax collection system is so unable was so unable to tax so much of the wealth that was lying around there and has been now shipped to the accounts in Switzerland on time, okay? The fact that the Greek, tax laws and the way in which they are settled in the courts takes so many years. So in other words, the fiscal, the Germans and the Nordics sort of got this right? The fiscal capacity of the state is one of the prerequisites of good policy, right? And especially in times of crisis. So that has been a problem. The weakness of the state in Southern Europe is one of the issues that has to be addressed. It has to, I could explain it as to the legacy of the political transition, etc. I won't get into it. But while they are right about this, right? This is the problem about the survival of the euro and of countries and of people that had nothing to do with the design flaws that I was talking about. Okay. The second is that during, as Professor Schmidt said earlier, during the build-up of the dynamic for the institutionalization of the euro, basically German banks who work in a very conservative regulatory environment in Germany, they saw amazing profit opportunities in Ireland and in Spain and so on and so forth, right? So they basically flooded this country. It wasn't like somebody like forced the Germans to go there, right? It was huge business opportunities to do, and they even contributed to the mirage of this Fata Morgana of the Mediterranean coast, which would be like where all Nordics who are tired of winter and cold will go and retire, okay? So consultancies for German banks contributed to this crazy illusion that was the real estate boom in the south, and flooded Spanish banks who, basically all of a sudden were receiving this crazy low interest money that they were not even used to. I mean, Spain was known for very high interest rates before the euro joined. So there was this crazy mismatch, there was this manias and panics, as a former historian of finance put it, that has made this bubble possible in the first place, right? Now, how this was allocated, if you actually read the reports of the people who should have been in charge, and I interviewed people in the Spanish central bank, I said, did you have anything saying there's a bubble, we have to pinch it, right? In 2005, nothing. The Spanish central bank had nothing on it, the ECB said nothing about it. The European Commission did not take a particular stance on it. So in a way, let's say, market forces will take care of this, and it will be the best kind of placement of investment possible. Well, now we come to say, maybe not. Germany is another reminder of something very uncomfortable to what Germany says today. If you look at debates around what are the best economic models in Europe in circa 2006, Spain was supposed to be a model for Italy, and even for Germany. Why? The Germans do all this retarded stuff, like they have vocational schools and they still make things that they export. Well, aren't we supposed to be in a post-industrial era in which manufacturing should be like slowly waning away from our economies? So that was the kind of standard, the economist line at the time. It now turns out that everybody wants to do vocational education because, by the way, these guys with high school, they don't find jobs. They would probably be more likely to be used as a productive labor force if you had vocational education and coordination between labor and capital, which was terrible, by the way, but it worked in Germany. So, in a way, these export-led economies had institutional bases that were built over decades, were criticized for a very long time. The North stuck to them, and for a good reason, and they seem to be doing much better. So that's another aspect that Germany, could be used for. And finally, let me say this, and I sound a little bit catty around it, but let me take the risk. Germany was good. You know what the Greece of the 1920s was Germany? A country saddled with that, abused by creditors, right? Humiliated, right? And then turned into bad politics. No, perhaps the Germans like to select on otherwise a very valuable and real episode of a hyperinflation during the Weimar. But the Weimar was also this part of a sovereign debt crisis in which Germany had no agency over, other than, not necessarily the bad policies they've done, because Sweden had a terrible situation, not a sovereign debt crisis, but a terrible economic crisis, and the answer was social democracy. In Germany, it was something else. So there are huge political risks being taken right now, especially whenever the Nazi party, with like the actual Nazi symbol in Greece, nailing down, I think, 9% in the last elections. And let me conclude. So, there is this study by Woes and Ponticelli, that's basically these guys have this data set looking at 50 years, I believe, the history of austerity episodes in Europe over, no, it's actually 100 years. It's 100 years. And they find out that the correlation between the depth of austerity over time, we really haven't had a long-term austerity yet. I mean, it's basically been 2 years. But the longer you push it and the deeper it gets, the more likely you are to encounter extreme forms of social violence, destruction of the labor skills, of very large swaths of the labor force, and in a lot of cases, political implosion. Okay. Now, these are some things that are basically circulated on very standard economics blogs like Fox, the and so on. But this is something to be taken into consideration. There are a lot of political risks entailed into it. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Professor Chamley. So he received his PhD from Harvard University, and today he is a professor at BU. His primary fields of study are information, public economics, macroeconomics, monetary theory, and economics. His current interests are in the macroeconomics, especially in coordination, and the history of public finance and debt. Professor Chamley will talk to us about the economics behind Europe, labor costs between different regions, specifically about Germany, and share with us his forecasts and recommendations.
No, I'm not going to share recommendations.
We're hoping.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. If you think economists understand what's going on, it's not true.
It's good to know.
I don't. I just don't. I should say it. I will speak as an economist, but will also speak as somebody who has been educated at the high school level in a contested region between France and Germany, and it is now the hometown of the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And so I think much progress has been made. I will still need my transparency, although I'm going to cut things short because I'm not going to speak as much as my colleagues for the, how do I actually... So, now you know, I mean, this has been said a few times, you know the German word for debt.
Guilt.
Which is Schuld, which is guilt. So it's the same word. Now, this has been said a few times in the newspaper. But you know, they should have also have told you what is the word in German for creditor. For creditor, it's Gläubiger, which is the same word as believer. So that's already puts some framework, different attitude between Germans and some other countries. Now, so as I said, I don't understand much about the economics, so I'm not sure I can really talk about it. But just a few remarks to organize some thinking about it. And I'm making you at least a tool for you when you read the newspaper. So, sure, there are issues of short term. So what we have is that you read about that all the time in the newspaper. Yesterday, the day before, and whatnot. Then we have these things about the bank failures, also. We talk a lot about deficit, austerity, so we have all these things that fill the newspapers right now. To some extent, you really wonder whether there is some kind of calamity that we have put on Europe, and now we have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So, and people seem to have forgotten completely what's the long-term issues. Why do we have all this kind of thing, all this mess? So there are a few good things that have happened to Europe right now, and works very well. In my view, the best thing that is working right now is the Schengen Agreement. And it's a wonderful thing to just go from one country to the other without any problem. But now, actually, from the long term, there is this question of that economists would ask, what is, the whole thing is to be about convergence between different economies. And economists tend to be, some economists at least, tend to be skeptical about that. And there is the question of long-term financial stability, fiscal stability, the question of banking union, fiscal union, political union, which is ultimately the goal, and it seems to have actually very counterproductive. Right now we have the Minister of Finance of Catalonia who is talking about Hacienda Propia. So, and he is a famous economist, I don't know what's correct.
Yeah.
And so he
I'm
talks,
a professor.
yeah, and which is not exactly the fiscal union that people are talking about. They are thinking about separating from the fiscal union inside of Spain. So this is now, and actually, on the long term, I would not be surprised if ultimately there were the abolition of the nation states at some point, you know, from a long-term point of view, that we have to say, after all, nation states have been a transitory period, and now we have a revival of the regions that we have in Europe. And it's not quite clear the new regions will be the same thing as inside of the nation states. Catalonia may be one of them, but there are other regions. Southern Germany could be, well, is much more integrated with other parts, neighboring countries. So it's not quite clear what the long term is going to be on that. Now, I think that so I think the decision process that is happening right now, and most of the time you see you have this crisis and everything that happens under duress. I will have to go, since I want to limit my time, I'm going to not to follow completely the overhead I prepare. Let's jump to the last one. Tip O'Neill. All politics is local. It's right. And that is true in our opinion. Now if you think that Europe started because of ideal and people who are idealistic, like Jean Monnet, I'm sorry again for the Jean Monnet thing, but if you think that's happening because of that, you're wrong. At every step of the European integration, it was national interest that was driving the whole process. So you would think this is a bit paradoxical. No, it's not, because everybody recognizes that France, for example, since I can talk about that, would be alone in the world, that would be very small and would be negligible. So, well, the idea is France is small, but we are going to, like any good financier or banker, we are going to use leverage. So we are going to use leverage, we are going to leverage on Germany. And so that the idea, the only way to have France big is to leverage on Germany. And therefore, we are going to have a European integration in that way. But, and everybody was thinking in the same way. If you think, what is the euro? Why do we have the euro? Well, because it was a bargain between Kohl and Mitterrand. You would not say that these are top economists, and, but there was a quid pro quo between the two. Mitterrand, who was old-fashioned, very skeptical of German unification, like others, not as much as Margaret Thatcher, but still very skeptical. And there would be a bargain that we are going to integrate, we are going to make the French franc into the franc 4 in Frankfurt, into the German mark, and that would be the bargain for that. And so that would be the creation of the euro. Now, this would be actually not irrelevant because Kohl himself made at the same time the same decision when he integrated East Germany and West Germany, where he decided to have one East German mark for one West German mark. And to some extent, the problems that came from that are not completely different from the problems that are right now in the euro. So to some extent, what happened inside of Germany before shares some common features with the process of what that we have now at the European level with the unified currency. Now, it's not, some problems are different. We don't have the same type of sovereign debt crisis and so on that we have. Sure, but there are some problems. Issue of conversions, for example, are important. For example, if you look at Germany right now, and the unemployment rate in Germany right now, you can see, well, the pink region is going from pink to dark, whatever, going blue. And the pink region in the south, that's Bavaria, and you can see that in general, where you have the higher unemployment on average, is still, right now, in the former East Germany. So it takes time for countries to converge, and to some extent the fixed exchange rate between the country is not a help in that process. Look at the fixed exchange rate between northern Italy and southern Italy. So it's not clear that facilitates the convergence. And actually economists are skeptical about convergence rates. So it's going to still, we are going to have problems, it seems, for a long time. Now, I was going to talk about Germany, and to some extent, let me make a few ad-lib remarks about that. 2 years ago, I went to the graduation of my son in a private school. My son is now with you, not in this room because he wants to be like me, but he's a student at Boston University. And so I went to his graduation, and in the graduation there were half, I realized suddenly that half the class was German, was a private school. And so the graduation dinner, there were all these, well, not a cheap school, so lots of parents were from small businesses in Germany. And they were mad and mad and mad. And they were raving, I mean, against some people. Who were these people? Not the Greeks, the East Germans. So they were really so upset about all this transfer that took place. So you can imagine what they would think now in the current situation. So this kind of nationalistic and self-interest which is driving the whole process, I think is critical in the whole, what has been going on. I have been reading on the early steps in the 50s and some of the initial initiatives that were taken about coal and steel and so on. You can see that every step it is national interest that predominates everything. So, and you do that, again, because that's the only way you can maintain something, or at least the people negotiate, politicians, some kind of elite, you can maintain this process with some kind of leverage in the international environment, which is much more tricky. Now, so what we have right now, I mean, there are so many things going on that, as I said, it's hard to say what's going on. Austerity, my gut feeling, is a big mistake. The debt thing, I mean, first of all, you can see, then I have little bits, not more than that. This is the interest rate on 10-year Greek bonds. I think this is eloquent enough. So you can see the declining part. This is when Greece joined the euro, so it's going down and down and down from 18% to near zero. I mean, it's a differential with the German bond. And then after the crisis, it goes on. So obviously, there is some myopia there somewhere. And who took Greece in the common market in the whole process? Giscard d'Estaing. And this was pure romanticism because of Greece and Hellenic civilization and so on. Everybody knew the Greeks were cheap, but I'm sorry for the Greeks, they're not responsible actually for both. Now, look at debt. This is the ratio of debt to GDP for the UK and the US. So you can see that, for example, in the 50s, UK debt was 2.5 GDP. On the long term, I'm going to stop because we go on and on. For the long term, I'm very pessimistic. My forecast is we have this kind of thing going on. So it's likely, although nobody can predict what's going on, now, that it will be stagnation for 10 years. After all, some countries went for that, Japan went for that. So it will be stagnation for a very long time. Eventually, Germany is not going to do so well. I think this is not going to last. But things could change, we never know. I mean, look at Spain. I mean, you cannot live with an unemployment rate like that. Young people, 40%.
52.
Yeah, so that's this thing could grow and so on. The big question is France. What will happen there? That's really the big question. And if the euro splits, my view is where does it split? With France inside or not inside? The Germans would not want France outside. So if the French are in, then Spain is in too. So these are tensions. I don't know what's going to happen.
Quick thank you again for all 4 of our panelists. It's an honor hearing from all of you. And we understand we were in a bit late, and it's already 7 o'clock, but we do actually have the room until 7:30. So any of you guys can stay, and if you guys want to stay, we'll open up the floor to questions right now. If you do need to go, feel free to. So anybody has any questions? Yeah.
I have a question for the person just spoke. What was Germany's national interest in terms of European integration? Like, what did they have to benefit, being so industrious and whatnot? How do they benefit from entertaining the peripheries to share risk and whatnot? Yes.
So the question is, what's the German interest on integration?
Yeah.
Integration of what, Germany or?
No, Germany is as a federal union, its national interest is unified with European integration.
What's the interest of Germany to integrate in Europe?
Yes.
Well, I mean, first of all, you can, well, again, it's step by step. There is no grand scheme or whatever. I think it's step by step. You have to see that the whole thing was decided in around 1990. It was not so obvious to unify Germany. It was not, there was some opposition. And so one way was to, just to give something for that. Now, you know, I mean, as you said yourself, Germany has a land structure which is very decentralized. So they can imagine that the whole thing would apply to Europe. They are fairly open to this kind of thing. And Germany, after all, is a recent state. And so why not? I mean, why? Actually, so far they have benefited tremendously from that. So why not? So, I mean, I don't see what the interest of Germany would be against the European integration. No? I think that's one thing which I forgot to say, but is to some extent the problems that we have now is, Jordi said that it's not labor cost. Still, the labor cost wage rates increase in Germany much less than in other countries in Europe because of this integration process between East and West Germany. And Schröder decided in the 90s to have the agenda, the 2000 to 2010, to moderate wage rates in Germany. So the last country in Europe that should have done that was Germany. And that's precisely the country that did that. So that created already an imbalance between Germany and the rest of Europe. But this was the interest of Germany that was pursued. And that created the problems for the rest of Europe. Now, if in Germany you talk about the Länder structure, recently, I mean, so what they have actually is the same thing as in Europe. They share to some extent, since they have different expenditures and different revenues for the budget. To some extent, the lenders share this kind of thing. Well, recently, Bavaria has made some noise not to do that anymore. So there are tensions there too.
I mean, this question is to really whoever wants to answer it. So I was reading today, if I'm not mistaken, that Spain wants to go for more austerity measures. And I remember this nice quote from Keynes when he suddenly said, why is spending so good only during war? Why does government only need to spend during war? So basically, my thing is that Danny Roderick and many other economists have spoken about, we seem to subvert democracy in countries to appease the investors outside who run it like a casino game. Basically, they vote on investor stocks on how they think the other one will vote it as. And you get herd theory eventually, and people leave, and just cause crisis in that particular economy that they were investing in. So my question is, will we inevitably see a return to depression or demand-sided economics? In other words, will we see spending rather than just trying to improve the supply side, which usually takes a long time, causes much pain, and also, shall we see government as, instead of lender of the last resort, employer of the last resort, as Minsky and many other people have stated before? Or in the other words, to tie it all together, is this the end of the neoclassical paradigm that has dominated most of economics?